Christian origin of liberal progressivism. Now, the compassion taught by a Christianized culture without Christ eventually becomes tolerance, and then that becomes a license for lifestyles and behaviors condemned by Scripture, such as sexual promiscuity, homosexuality, and the killing of unborn children, to name just a few. This is the eventual result of the teaching of the Nicolaitans that Jesus hates. Now, when the gospel comes to a people group, as born-again followers of Jesus Christ, they are taught to love their neighbors and even their enemies and not to judge one another. They are taught compassion for the helpless, for widows and orphans. They are also taught to obey the Lord's holy commands by living holy lives as pilgrims in this life. And those who are able must work for a living and to help others. Now, eventually, this compassion for all as taught and commanded by the Lord becomes embedded in the culture. When this happens, as it inevitably does in all Christian cultures, those who are not born-again disciples of Christ are also taught to love and accept others. Since they do not believe in the existence of a holy God and of hell, they do not believe in personal responsibility before God for their actions and their behavior. They do not follow God and His commands, but rather the sinful nature with which they were born. Thus, the compassion taught by the culture eventually becomes tolerance, and then it becomes license for lifestyles and behaviors condemned by Scripture. For example, sexual promiscuity, homosexuality, and the killing of unborn children, to name just a few. Now, interestingly, Islam, Hinduism, and Buddhism all share the Bible's position on such issues. They don't believe in those behaviors. Only in post-Christian nations do we find the complete acceptance and even shaking our fist at God delight in such practices. The gay pride parades taking place regularly in Western cities are vivid examples of this. Only in the post-Christian West, for example, do we provide free needles to drug addicts? And does the city freely allow the homeless to defecate on its streets, after which the city must clean up at its own expense? Such compassion, which releases people from all personal responsibility, is not what the Lord taught and commanded. It's rather the result of what happens in a culture when Christ is removed from Christianity. This inevitably takes place in every culture a few centuries after the gospel has been introduced, as has already taken place in America and Western Europe. It is known that living in a Christianized culture, with churches on every street corner, ironically but not surprisingly immunizes people to the message of the gospel. History is linear and not circular, repeating itself over and over and over and over. History began in Genesis, and it has a definite ending. After the gospel is introduced to a certain culture or people group, the primary harvest for that people group is reaped. Then the focus of the gospel moves on to another region of the world where it has never been heard, as is currently taking place in India. The process will be repeated again elsewhere until the gospel of the kingdom has been preached in the whole world as a testimony to all nations. And all those whose names are written in the book of life have received the Messiah, and then the end will come. As perhaps the best example of this, take the Middle East, where the gospel was born 2,000 years ago. According to Acts, the gospel spread rapidly in that region of the world, including the Mediterranean, within the short span of a few generations. The primary harvest in the Middle East was therefore reaped at that time. Consequently, the focus of the gospel moved elsewhere in the world. Now, although there still remains a final gleaning of the harvest to take place in the Middle East, it is noteworthy that the Middle East today is and will likely remain overwhelmingly Muslim during these last days. The primary harvest there was already reaped 2,000 years ago.